Dear viewers, welcome to a new episode of the Arab Identity Program, the program from which we launch a platform to re understand our identity and defend it in the face of the challenges it faces and question its re-emergence and a new awakening. We have defined previously the Arab identity, and we said that the Arab person is not only the one who belongs to an Arab nation or speaks the Arabic language or belongs to an Arabic tribe, but also he or she who belongs to the Arab identity culturally or emotionally, and that it is a non ethnic and cross ethnic, non geographical identity. And we went through the history of the development of Arab identity through the various stages, including the Islamic Empire till the Ottoman Empire, and a few of the critical events of the 20th century. Today, we will be revisiting the past of the Arabs and connecting it with the present and future. The first mention of Arabs appeared in the mid ninth century before Christ as a tribal people in eastern and southern Syria and the northern Arabian Peninsula. Arabs appear to have been under the vassalage of the new Assyrian Empire from 911 to 612 BCE, as well as the succeeding New Babylonian 626 to 539 BCE, the Achaemenid from 539 to 332 BCE, the Seleucid and the Parthian empires. The Nabateans are an Arab people who formed their kingdom near Petra in the 3rd century BCE. Arab tribes, most notably the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids, began to in the southern Syrian desert from the mid 3rd century CE onward during the mid to later stages of the Roman and Sasanian empires. The Arabs forged the Rashidun Khilafah, the Umayyad Khilafah, the Abbasid Khilafah, and the Fatimid Khilafats, whose borders reached southern France in the west, China in the east, Anatolia in the north, and Sudan in the south. This was one of the largest land empires in history. In the early 20th century, the First World War signaled the end of the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled much of the Arab world since conquering the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517. The end culminated in 1922 defeat and dissolution of the empire and the partition of its territories, forming the modern Arab states. Following the adoption of the Alexandria Protocol in 1944, the Arab League was founded on 22 March 1945. The Charter of the Arab League endorsed the principle of an Arab homeland whilst respecting the individual sovereignty of its member states. Today, Arabs primarily inhabit the 22 member states of the Arab League. The Arab world stretches from 13 million kilometers square from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Arabian Sea in the east, and from the Mediterranean Sea in the north to the Horn of Africa and the Indian Ocean in the southeast. People of non Arab ethnicities associated with non Arabic languages also live in these countries, sometimes as a majority. These include Somalis, Kurds, Berbers, the Afar people, Nubians, and others. Beyond the boundaries of the League of Arab States, Arabs can also be found in a global diaspora. The ties that bind Arabs are ethnic, linguistic, cultural, historical, identical, nationalist, geographical, and political. The Arabs have their own customs, language, architecture, art, literature, music, dance, media, cuisine, dress, society, sports, and mythology. Arabs are a diverse group in terms of religious affiliations and practices. In the pre Islamic era, most Arabs followed polytheistic religions. Some tribes had adopted Christianity or Judaism, and few individuals, the Hanifs, apparently observed another form of monotheism. Today, about 93% of Arabs are adherents of Islam, and there are sizable Christian minorities. Arab Muslims primarily belong to the Sunni, Shia, Ibadi, and Alawite dominations. Arab Christians generally follow one of the Eastern Christian churches, such as those within the Oriental Orthodox churches, Eastern Catholic churches, or Eastern Protestant churches. There also exist small numbers of Arab Jews still living in Arab countries and a much larger population of Jews descended from Arab Jewish communities living in Israel and various Western countries, who may or may not consider themselves Arab today. Christian minorities in Arab majority states may also not consider themselves Arab sometimes, such as the Copts and Assyrians. Other smaller minority religions also exist, such as the Druze, Zoroastrianism, and Baha'i faith. Arabs have greatly influenced and contributed to diverse fields, notably the arts and architecture, language, philosophy, mythology, ethics, literature, politics, business, music, dance, cinema, medicine, science, technology, and ancient and modern history. With me to discuss this further is Professor Nabeel Abraham. We bring him on screen. Hello, Doctor.
Morning.
Dr. Nabeel Abraham has devoted his life's work to the study of Arab Detroit and Arab Americans generally. His writing on various aspects of the community spanned 4 decades. He co edited 2 volumes of the Arab Detroit series, as well as a forthcoming volume titled Hadha Baladuna of Creative Writing, Wayne State University Press. In addition to other collections, uh, Dr. Abraham has contributed numerous essays in various journals, books, and encyclopedias. Dr. Abraham taught anthropology at Henry Ford College in Dearborn, Michigan. That's when I first met him for 3 decades, where he also directed the honors program until his retirement in 2013. Dr. Abraham served as executive director of the Association of Arab American University Graduates from 1979 to 1980. He also established the Detroit Regional Office of the ADC, serving as its local spokesman and advisor from 1980 to 1985. Dr. Abraham's experiences growing up in Detroit starting in the 1950s provides much of the material on which he draws for his current work. Welcome again, Doctor, and it's a pleasure to see you on this platform. And I'm sure many of your former students will be excited to see you.
My pleasure.
Arabs past. One thing that the Islam as a religion did when it first appeared is in its intention to fight polytheism and the previous faith of the people. It tried to shut down the door of the past and focus on the new faith and belief. And it called everything that was previous to it a term al-jahiliyyah, which means the age of ignorance. Muslims did not look backwards, and they looked forward in the centuries following Islam, especially with the fast expansion of the empire all over the world. We come today to revisit that past, the Arab past that extends to almost 1,000 years before Christ. That history that is connected throughout that time with its rich and diverse facets is important in shaping and understanding the Arab identity today. What can you tell us about the ancient history of Arabs?
Well, contrary to, I guess, popular assumption that the Arabs are just sitting in the desert of Arabia and there's not much going on. And then they have a few things happen in the past, and then suddenly in the 7th century of the Common Era, AD, you have the appearance of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, and so forth. But actually, the history, the more, at least that I look at it, and I think everyone should, especially people who consider themselves Arabs today, should look at that past, because it's from that past that so much happens later. And the peoples that are in the past, so one of the weirdest things, you have people in Iraq, in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, of course. In these areas, you have a deep, deep history, ancient history. So where are the Babylonians and the Sumerians and the Assyrians and the Akkadians? Another version of Babylonian. The people, Damascus, ancient city, so forth. The Phoenicians, the Canaanites. Well, those are the people today, the same people. They just evolved culturally, linguistically, not really that much if you look at those languages. And of course, the religions, the worldview has changed with Islam, Christianity, Judaism. I would consider Judaism as part of this whole package. So you have Arabs appearing, as you suggested, in the ninth century before Common Era, before the BC, before Christ. So 853, the year 853 BC, there's a big battle takes place at a place called Karkar. And in that battle, the Assyrians are moving in and they're having a showdown with Ahab and the people of what is now called Samaria in the central part of Palestine. And he's allied. Who are his allies? He's got according to the Assyrians, he has an ally who has 1,000 camels. Jundub, okay? And according to the Assyrian literature. So the Arabs are there in major ways. But one of my arguments is that they're being erased. They've been erased by not only Westerners, by the biblical studies, but they're also being erased by Arabs today because they don't go back and dig into that. That is their history. So yeah, Arab Muslims obviously are very proud of the fact that they were visited. God chose Arabic and an Arab prophet for them. That's fine. That's great. But there's a whole history before that we've disconnected from. Okay. By disconnecting from that history, two things happen. Well, three things. One, you have your own ignorance about your past, and then therefore you get threatened by the past. You get very threatened by it. Yeah, there are exceptions made in the Ghassanid period, in the early Christian period. You have great poets that Arab historians have recorded. You have a lot of fighting too, but so they've accepted some of that. But you leave yourself ignorant of a lot of things, and that ignorance plays into two problems: the Westerners, and I would include the Zionists in that thing. For Palestinians, now let me talk about the Palestinians. We have a problem because they walk up to us, the Zionists come, even though we are descendants of Canaanites, Canaanim, and Philistines who are coastal people who may have come from the Greek islands or something. We're not, it's not really clear. Okay, and then, but most of the people of Palestine, just as in Lebanon and Syria, are the descendants of the peoples that were there. But what happens is, what the game they play is, well, you guys are Arabs. And the Arabs showed up in Palestine in, I think, the year 638 AD. In Fatah, the great conquests. And so you're latecomers because we have been there for 2,000 years ahead of you. As if that gives them a license to conquer somebody's land and claim it's theirs. Okay? But it's still a weakness that we open on ourselves because we don't claim our history. Okay, and then for the Arab world in general, the same thing applies. Westerners come along, and what do? They go to people in Lebanon, in Syria, Iraq, and they say, well, you're not really Arabs. You're Phoenicians. You're descendants of Babylon, Chaldeans, Assyrians, but you're not Arabs. Arabs came out of the desert. Well, no. The Arabs, there were Arabs in the desert, which was actually quite busy place. And well, I'll talk about that. But the important thing is that they can play this divide and rule on people. I met so many Lebanese who told me, well, I'm Maronite and I'm a Phoenician, really. And we're not the same as the Arab. The Arab came out of Arabia. That's the same mentality that the Westerners played, the colonialists played on the Middle East, the Middle Eastern peoples, and that ignorance plays into dividing people up.
How do you comment on that as an anthropologist, doctor? Someone says from Egypt that he's a pharaoni, extends to the pharaohs, or someone
Right.
in Lebanon, Phoenicians. Although there is no continuity in that history, how can a person identify with
Well,
an ancient? Mhm.
first of all, my response to them is, well, what happened? Where did the other Egyptians come from? All those peasants that you see when you go to Egypt, it's a country swimming in peasantry, farmers. Where did those people come? They came out of Arabia? They didn't come out of Arabia. They were the same people that they're the descendants genetically, physically, of the pharaonic peoples and pre-pharaonic even. It goes way back, maybe 7, 8,000 years.
Mhm.
Okay, so it just happens that at one point, the people in Egypt, uh, largely, I can't say all of them, but many of them became Christians, what we call Copts, Copts, Coptic Church, followers of that church, Church of St. Mark. And so they grabbed onto that mantle, the rope that says we go back to the ancient Egyptians. Well, then the ones that became Muslim, and it took a while for Egypt to become Muslim and speak Arabic. Okay, didn't happen overnight. Just like um, France took a long time. Lots of places in Europe took a long time to become Catholic and Christian. This anthropologically, this doesn't always happen quickly. But anyway, Egypt has this history, and so a lot of them became Muslims. You were Christian, and some of the Christians became Muslims. That's that's how it happens. It's the same people. Now they may have been different classes. Some of them may have been working with the Greek power at that time, or the Roman power, or you know, uh, Egypt was ruled by so many different groups. So some may have been allied here or there. Some might have been city people versus country people. Some was Said versus. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, these people evolved into what is you have today. Now you
Doctor,
go to the
sorry, but just a follow up on that. So that's in terms of religion. So when we talk about the Arabization of an area like Egypt, how does that happen from a perspective of anthropology? And does that make them any less Arab than, for example, the people in Hijaz or in the Arabia?
in Arabia. Well, it depends if you want to call a genetic, that there's a genetic core DNA to what is the peoples of Arabia, and that the people in, say, North Africa or even Lebanon and Syria don't have that genetic component. So what? Look at the United States. We're Americans. We know the history of the United States, more or less. It's not an old country. And secondly, it has people from all over. Now, there was a time, even when I was growing up, when Americans considered Northwest European to be the real Americans, British Isles, Scandinavia, Germany, Denmark, Holland. And that idea has gone. I mean, maybe a few people left, but by and large, it's not accepted anymore. You can have a black president. You can have a black vice president, Mexican. So what happened in these countries is Arab to me has always been not a racial or it's only ethnic when you take it out of the Arab world to bring it to, say, the United States. Then you become an ethnic group if you stick together. And I grew up that way. I've written a lot about it. But in the Arab world, you're a Homsi or a Beiruti or a Utsi or, whatever. You're tied to your town, your city, your village, and you speak a dialect of Arabic, and you can then relate to other Arabs through a Fusha, through a modern standard Arabic. But the Arab concept functions like the American concept in many ways. It's that anybody can join. I mean, if you want, you can become an Arab. And racially, we have Arabs cover all colors, skin colors, hair color, hair type. I have relatives who have red hair. They live they never, left. They have red hair. Others, they're dark skinned. So that concept of Arab is broad enough to be cultural.
Hmm.
It's a cultural notion.
Exactly, and that's a very important revisit today of the Arab identity is to emphasize that it is a cultural, non-geographical entity. But you said something interesting that when the Arab comes to America, it's more defined in an ethnic terms. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, what happened in the past, see, even in the 20th century, things changed. Okay, in the beginning of the 20th century, early 1900, you came to America, you might have lived in a neighborhood, or if you want to call it a ghetto, glorified ghetto, say in Brooklyn, and there was a bunch of Arabs there, okay? And many of them Christian, but there were Muslims too. When my father came to America, it was 1910, something like that. He came from a Muslim village in Palestine. They had Muslims and Christians. Majority were Christian for many reasons, which I could go into later. And they hung out together, and they, call themselves Muhammadan and Nasrawi, and follower of Muhammad, Muslim or Christian, or they call each other from different villages, and they'd argue with each other. I know the Lebanese and Sharre and in this place, and but they kind of had an affiliation because they spoke a language they could communicate in. They had foods and cultural traits that they shared, and they respected each other's religious rituals and holidays and so forth. What happened later, but they stayed on the margin of society. That is to say, the way you went into the mainstream of American society was you blended in. You took an Anglo-sounding name. You went, if you wanted to go up the class thing, you name your kids Ralph.
You integrate into America, basically.
Huh?
You integrate into white America.
You assimilate. Yeah. And so Ralph Nader was a great Arab American. His father is Lebanese. They're Greek Orthodox. I forgot from which village, but he establishes in a small town in Connecticut a business. And Ralph and his sisters and brothers, they go to the major universities. Ralph Nader graduated from Harvard. His sister is she may have retired now, was a big professor of anthropology at Berkeley. His other brother was a very big man in the development of community colleges. So, but they all had Anglo names. Laura, I think David is one brother, Ralph. And they their Lebanese background was in the background for the most part. I once met his father at an Arab American conference, and I asked him why doesn't his son. I knew the answer actually. Why doesn't his son come out and speak out on Arab issues? This is like in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
He said, well, because it would hurt him. He has a lot of American Jewish allies. He has, he works with people like that. He ultimately did come out, but not at that time. Okay, so that was the way it was done. Now, you come to the 60s, 70s, 80s, so forth. America began changing. It began accepting increasingly an ethnic identity by people, Polish. In fact, there was a period in the 70s, I think it was in the 70s, where I'm proud to be Chaldean. I'm proud to be Polish. I'm proud to be Italian. Everybody was doing their thing. And then the city started sponsoring ethnic festivals. It was basically around food and costume and music. But the idea was this was being brought in, that American mainstream society was willing to accept you kind of softened, but you can come in as an Arab or Italian or whatever. And Hollywood then plays with those images. You see that. It's not always good. The mafia image of the Italians was really hurt them in many respects. So now, as you see in places like Dearborn, Michigan, and elsewhere, Arabs, which means really multiple groupings, right? Yemenis, Lebanese, Syrians, Palestinians, Iraqis, can all coalesce, and they can make alliances, political alliances. They can separate depending on where they are, and they're free to do what they want. Arab is really, in this country now, I think, is primarily a broad catch-all. It's like Hispanic. When you talk about Cubans and Nicaraguans, El Salvador, Mexicans, etc., they have a lot of differences. Their different histories come together to America. But the government and the outside can throw them in and say Hispanic, which simply means Spanish speakers. Okay, so with I think Arabs or Middle East, you can say Middle Easterners, mostly Arab. See, with Middle Eastern, you can put in Persians or Iranians. You can put the Israelis would like to try to get in, I think, sometimes, but I don't know what their thinking is now. At one time, they tried to play the game that they were Middle Easterners.
I mean, we haven't even gotten an official designation yet. It's still not on the census, right?
Who's that?
As Arabs.
Oh no, it doesn't have Arabs don't have an official designation. There's a history to that. We tried, especially led by James Zogby. They tried to get into the census as Arab.
And we still struggle to do that. It's still, it was rejected by the last administration.
Well, also some of the Arabs themselves didn't want it. They didn't want the minority status.
Mm-hmm.
The well-to-do business people, professionals didn't want it back in the day. Now they may have changed now.
But they can always choose. I mean, if it's an option, they can still choose to be designated as white, right? It's not.
Well, but when you have when you get labeled that you are getting preferential treatment, say under affirmative action, some people don't want that designation because they feel it makes them disadvantaged, that they needed assistance to get into Harvard or get a small business loan or business contract, government contract. So back then, they didn't want it. A lot of them did not want that's what they considered a stigma.
So, Doctor, I'm gonna give you a scenario. Sorry, did I cut you off? I don't want to cut you off.
No, yeah, you didn't cut me off.
let's say an Arab woman married a Caucasian man, and they got, let's say that they had a divorce or something happened, and then their son, the boy, grew up with the mother. That boy doesn't speak Arabic.
Hmm.
He does not, officially belong to like an Arab tribe, or he doesn't belong to any of the 22 Arab
No.
states. But he grew up with his mom culturally Arab, and
Hmm.
he considers himself an Arab.
Hmm.
Is that an ethnic identity?
It's an acquired ethnic identity, sure. You can acquire it.
So there is no problem with using the word ethnic, even if it's a cultural identity.
In my opinion, no.
Okay. Is that mainstream or?
Depends. I think at college campuses, at least till recently, for sure, that I'm aware of, a college campus is a place where a lot of middle class, upper middle class children of one or two Arab professionals, usually business people, would come and discover their Arab identity. The universities tended to be the place. Among that class, obviously there are working class. If you go to Dearborn, as you probably well know, places like that. There's working class Arab American. We call the shabab, or the guys that hang out together. They went to high school together, whatever. Maybe work or use networks of work together. Okay, they may have their own identity as certain macho, certain sports oriented, certain mosque oriented, perhaps, or church. But the middle class, upper middle class Arab Americans, let's say that their parents is a doctor, a surgeon, or something, and the mother might be non-Arab background, Polish or something. The kid comes and discovers, hey, I'm an Arab because there's the Arab Club or the Palestine Solidarity Club or Muslim Club at the university. And then they develop their identity around that. What happens after they graduate is anyone's guess. Some hold on to it, some keep the connections, and others just kind of, that was a stage in their life. Um, to some degree, I went through some of that, even though I came from a household that was very, my mother was a Palestinian refugee. And she insisted we were Arabs. She stressed Arab more than Palestinian back then. Arabs, Muslims, and that we were to excel in school, but we weren't supposed to date the girls and, uh, you know, uh, go on to college, things like that.
Yeah.
Uh, when I got by the time I was in high school, I didn't grow up in an Arab community per se, even though I'd go to the masjid, the mosque, occasionally, less and less. Um, by the time I got to college, I was basically an American kid who had an Arabic name, considered himself a Muslim, non-practicing, and uh, recognizing Arab food, of course, liking a lot of it, but uh, not really involved in anything. I got involved in at the university with a political group, Organization of Arab Students, which was at that point reinvigorated by the Palestinian Revolution. So I said, "Wow, this is something that seems worthwhile to identify with," because also my view of the Arabs at that time was post 1967. 1967, for the young people listening, was a devastating defeat for several Arab armies. Egypt, Syria, Jordan were the so-called Six-Day War, It was a humiliating defeat, great humiliation. And even though I wasn't there, being a Palestinian, you had your hopes on Jamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, and I was humiliated along with everybody else. So the Arabs, I think it was Leonid Brezhnev, president of the USSR, said the Arabs can't shoot a donkey. You feel, yeah, maybe we can't.
Mm-hmm.
Now they recovered in 1973 a little bit, but the point being, the Palestinian movement came as a phoenix rising from the ashes, and people glommed around it. I was one of them.
Thanks, Doctor, for that personal reflection. We're going to come back when we relate this topic to the future, trying to pull back to the main subject. But before that, I want to end this tangent with a question. As you know, I'm posing this question to anthropology.
Yeah.
Is it common in anthropology that an ethnic identity evolves into a cultural identity?
I guess. I mean, depending on how we define these terms, I would think Irish today. When you meet somebody in America who says they're Irish, and generally they're not from Ireland, they might have been to Ireland as a tourist, but to them, Irish means St. Patrick's Day drinking, wearing something green, making some statements about their behavior that is Irish, like maybe they're quick-tempered or able to drink a lot or celebrate or something. I would say that's a cultural affiliation. That's a cultural identity that has little to do with Ireland and the Irish and a real Irish ethnic identity, if you can find one here. I did know a guy who was a very Irish back when I worked out in the East Coast, and he was from Ireland, and he was, I think, connected to the IRA, but he would never tell me. And he was a working class fellow, and he was very pro-Palestinian. And most Irish Americans don't know anything about Palestine, at least back in the day, didn't really know much. And so when I meet Irish, they're different people in my book than Irish Americans whose connection to Ireland or the Irish culture is very superficial. Now, you can take Black Americans, and they readily are different from Africans, sub-Saharan Africans. And that's very readily understandable, just like Arab Americans, if they've been here long enough, are different from Lebanese in Lebanon or Syria or Palestine. The difference here is there's a lot of back and forth travel.
Mm-hmm.
When that travel wasn't there, you could tell the big difference.
Yeah.
Lebanese Americans, I'll use the specific Lebanese American, Palestinian Americans, so on. When I went to Palestine, I didn't grow up in Palestine. I went to Palestine several visits. They know you're not from there. Well, first of all, the accent. If you speak Arabic at all, they know immediately. Their ear tells them this is not a local. As we know in Lebanon, they can tell you which country from. They know. This is a Beiruti, east, west, whatever.
Doctor, in that sense, do you consider the Arab American identity as a different identity from Arab identity, or is it
I think so. I think you could say
or is it a sub branch? Like, is it a branch?
A branch, if allowed to move on its own over time, would become something different.
So can we say that every Arab American is an Arab, but not every Arab is an Arab American?
Well, definitely not every Arab. You mean you have 150 million or 200 million people in the official Arab world? No, they have nothing to do with
But every Arab American is an Arab, so it makes it a subset.
to whatever, however you want to define that. Yeah, take the jokes. I mean, first of all, language is a big thing. For Arabs, language is a big, big, big thing, right?
Right.
I mean, that in a way defines you. So they are very, I mean, obviously kinship, who's your relative, who's your uncle, who's your father, and so forth. But your behavior too, for example, a kid who grew up in America, who didn't know enough, might put his shoes up, his feet up on the table, right? And then his grandmother or grandfather come from the old country or uncle, and that is an immediate insult. He doesn't know enough not to do that, okay? Or to stand up when they come into the room. I mean, there's a lot of these little nuances that define a proper person in the home setting, in the home country. It carries on here to some degree, but it has to be worked at a lot by the parents. How big is the family network? How much are they strict? And then if you combine it with the religious institution, the mosque, the church, whatever, and how much, but they can't fill in everything. There's too much that goes on in a culture. It's like you're a software programmer. So there's too much programming that goes on as you grow up in a culture. I know this because I spent time in multiple places in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, and I always felt like an outsider, even with Palestinians. I mean, that's the closest I could get, and you feel like an outsider by default because you don't know all the nuances, and your speech pattern is different. Your
Yeah,
walk, the way
naturally.
you walk is different. The way you know wear a hat.
But at the end, it's a spectrum of how much a person acquires of these customs and traditions and language. But at the end, it is deeper. Like identity is deeper than that. It's
Yeah,
more of a wujdan, yani more of a feeling, consciousness. Like you said, you considered the 1967 defeat humiliating to you.
yeah,
You grew up as an American. There is this deep, and this is one of the things I wrote in my book, that if you become happy for Arab achievements and sad for their shortcomings, that's a sign that you have an Arab identity.
yeah. I
Uh,
see. Well, that's a good definition. I think that's a good working definition. Sure.
Doctor, another question, also, from an anthropological point of view. Let's say, for example, a person, let's say me, for example, if I love French history and French food and French film and French music, and I'm connected, somehow inspired by its history and its
Yeah.
art. How much, from an anthropological point of view, how much does that make me acquire a French culture or being partly French? Is that something that is?
Yeah, I think you can acquire a good deal.
Mhm.
I mean, people do it every day from America. The problem is, how do the natives feel? How do the I have a let's call him a friend. I don't want to describe him any further because might give it away. So he's successful. He's on his own. He's living on his own. He's working for a big corporation, and this is in the United States. But he's originally from Palestine. When I talk to him on the phone from time to time, it's not a lot. I get this feeling the way he talks that he's trying too hard to be an American. certain kind. And me as an American, and many, it took me a long time to admit that I'm an American. We can talk about that too. Um, it just seems weird to me that, okay, yeah, he's living here. He's probably going to die here. I mean, he's probably spent his whole life here. Okay, but he grew up in a big family in Palestine, and he's been here now, I'd say 15 years, and he's put on a lot of the airs of what I think he's trying to be an American, what he thinks.
What do you mean by an American? You mean like a Caucasian, or?
Yeah, kind of like just a white guy with no ethnic
Affiliation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I'll even throw some Arabic at him, and he knows, of course he knows what I was talking about, but I always get a response in English, and I get this kind of very what's the word for it? Very slick, very catchy, very trying to be cool.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it just, I don't know, it doesn't sit right with me.
What does it? Is it? What do you? I mean, if someone chooses to abort one identity and acquire another identity, how natural is that? What do they lose with that? Is there examples in anthropology where that harmed people or benefited them?
I don't know of any studies, but in anthropology, but I can tell you, I've watched this. I think they lose. There's something empty, at least from my vantage point. Maybe I'm unfair. Okay, so I mean, I just see them as trying to be something that aren't quite it. It's like me pretending to be, I don't know, a sports athlete. I'm not an athlete, never was. But if I put on the suit and walk and pretend that I play, whatever, and I'm not really, I mean, I could be practicing and all that, but it's one thing to try to play the game. It's another thing to pretend that you're more than what you are. I don't know how to explain it. It just doesn't sit well with me.
Do you think it's an obstacle in front of?
Even though I have to admit, I did it in reverse. So I learned. I spoke Arabic as my first language. You probably want to save this for another time, but I had to go to university to learn Arabic. Okay, and it was a long struggle. And then I spent a lot of time with Arabs practicing Arabic, and they'd laugh at me. You know, I'd make mistakes and stuff. This was when I was in college, and I went to the Middle East, and they still say the Sadak Eid, or they would, you know, Salak Mudda Mish Aish, you know, في عندنا. So, and then my accent was a mess because I studied a little bit in Egypt, studied in Lebanon, so forth. So I don't have one straight accent. So every time I meet Arabs in the Arab world, they're impressed that I can speak Arabic and I can follow them and understand them, although I had the hardest time in Algeria and Yemen, okay? Because there's a lot of Berber, as you know, in French, in Algerian dialect, and then Yemen, it's a South Arabia. It is a world unto itself. And I still have trouble, even though I did my research on Yemenis. I have the hardest time following them. Okay. But the problem is, I tried to be an Arab the way this fellow, I think, that I mentioned, is trying to be an American, right? But I realized at some point you can probably pull it off. One can do it, but it takes an enormous effort that you're kind of like trying to what they used to call in America passing. That is Black people, African Americans, who were light-skinned enough that they would pass as white. This was happening in early 19th century, 18th century, 19th, 20th centuries, where they could get by as white. Okay. And I was trying to get by as Arab. Um, but it's not an easy thing to do. You can't. I know people who did. I have a brother who lives in an Arab country. I don't know what his grade is.
Well, I feel that. Let me just say something here. That I feel that this, if we understand that the Arab identity is an Arab is it has to do with a connection to Arab culture and Arab history and Arab customs, Arab values, regardless of language. Maybe we don't have to try so hard. And I feel that this trying so hard sometimes repels some of our younger generation and Arab Americans, feeling that they are somehow less Arab because they don't speak the language.
Mm.
And we need to work on separating the language from the Arab identity. Although I understand how, like it's almost a manifestation of Arab identity, the language itself. It's like the storage of all the culture and civilization is in the Arab language. It is our art and architecture and everything. But regardless of that, today we need to separate the language from the culture, being that we have a huge Arab diaspora,
Yeah.
almost equivalent in numbers to the Arabs in the Arab world, and also it's becoming an international, non-geographical cultural identity. So we
Yeah.
need to separate it a little bit from the language, to give the ease of being an Arab to the new generations growing up in the diaspora.
Okay. I see where you're going with this, and I agree with you. I think you're right, because if we don't do what you're saying, you're going to lose a whole generation and every other generation. Because if the standard is going to be you must speak the language par excellence, all right, then you're going to, very few people will qualify. It's very hard. I tried it. It's not easy. I mean, I can manage. I even lectured in Arabic, but uh, very few people can achieve that. Um, you're right. Well, in America or in France or in Holland or Germany, wherever, you can afford to relax that rule. If only the Arabs in the Middle East, in the Arab world, would do that when they come and visit.
Right, and they
They're
have.
the, they're the ones that are going to bring out the whip, and they're going to say, well, you don't really measure up. They're going to do it in different ways, but they're going to basically say that. But
Yeah.
uh,
Why would we pick this as a criteria? Why not understanding Arab history or being devoted to Arab cause? And in that way, you'll take the whip on them.
yeah. I did the same thing. I mean, I tried the same thing. It's the way to do it, and I think that's what you're saying is going to happen. Why? Because in places like Dearborn, Michigan, Hamtramck, Dearborn Heights, the whole Metro Detroit area, Arabs, Muslims, various types of Arabs, Yemeni, Iraqi, Syrian, Lebanese, Palestinian, they're on the map. They are on the political, social, cultural map. And so you can flourish. The kids in Fortson High or wherever, they can flourish. And they don't have to know more than several dozen words of Arabic. Probably half of them will be cuss words. But they will have, identifiable names, Muhammad, Ahmed, whatever. And even without those names. So yeah, it will happen. It's happening. It's
Right.
happening irrespective of what the old world wants and what the old generation wants. would like to see. The old generation probably has resigned itself. They know. We tried to teach them, and they always tell me that. We tried to teach them Arabic. They didn't, they didn't learn. It's, I know.
The focus on language has actually kept us backwards, because it's a very heavy language.
Hmm.
It's not, it's even dissipating in the Arab world itself. And we've attached our identity to it, and it's a very heavy ship to sail.
Right.
If we separate that and then work on the Arab culture, customs, music, understanding of history, severe that attachment to the language. And I'm totally with working on the language at the same time, but severe the attachment of the identity to the language, because we can flourish
Right.
without it.
And I'll tell you something. What was I going to say? People see you. I like to use, and I threw this out, American as a concept for Arab or Arabian, if you will. Okay, I'm playing here with the words. Where Americans will tolerate you. I always thought this. If I come to America and I speak Arabic, but I don't speak English well, they'll tolerate you. They'll say, "Okay, good, you're trying." In the Middle East, when I went to the Arab world, they don't tolerate. Well, you're supposed to be Arab. Now, if you're a white person, if you're an American or British or French, and you speak some Arabic, oh, that's great.
Yeah.
They tolerate that. They accept you. But
Yeah.
if they consider you should know, then they kind of unintentionally humiliate you. If we adopt the American attitude, which I think is a healthy one, hey, you're trying. You came from Mexico. You came from Egypt. You're trying. Okay, good. We accept you. Yeah.
Yeah. Professor, that's a separate subject. There is some sort of a dismissal or undermining of the Arab diaspora and the Arab world, and they are losing a great opportunity. I call it like the unsung oil or tharwa, the resource for the Arab world
Resource,
in
yeah.
terms of intellect and labor and technical skills and investment power and political influence and
Yeah.
just look at 16 million Lebanese outside Lebanon that can, if they decide to, they can make Lebanon the richest country in the Middle East within a year. And they're totally ignored. I mean, we've taken the right to vote recently, by much work. But to come back, because we're almost out of time, Doctor, come back to wrap up the subject. I know that we probably need 10 episodes on this, but to wrap up this subject, and we're sure to host you again for various topics that has been very interesting. Arabs in the past and in the future. I mean, the ancient history of Arabs and how it influences in the present and in the future. I just wanted to talk about how we do have a very rich ancient history. We're not just a few Bedouin tribes in the desert that, after acquiring Islam, had some conquest. That's not the history of Arabs. The history of Arabs goes way beyond that, with tens of kingdoms and a huge civilization that extends from northern Syria and Mesopotamia, from Iraq to
Yeah. Can I just add one thing? I want to just interject one thing. All of them, the Sabaeans in the South Arabia, the Hadramautis, the Qataba, and then you go up to the north to the Nabateans, the Palmyra, Tadmor. They were all peaceful. They were trading. They were making money. They were running caravans. They were in the business of business, and they did very well. And they were ultimately crushed either by Romans, Assyrians, different groups. But they were generally not militaristic that you find, say, among the Assyrians. And I think even some of what are going to be calling themselves Jews, and of course, like the Romans, they were very militaristic. These people were really not looking for, and they developed poetry to a high art. They developed architecture to a decent skyscrapers in Arabia, in you know pre Christian times. They were very. It's just they didn't leave a lot of writing. They left a lot of poetry. They left the inscription, and they gave us, along with the Canaanites, they gave us language, alphabet. By the way, the Nabateans probably gave us Arabic, North Arabic, written Arabic. I'm finding that as I read more that they are the people that were key, and their cousins, the Medians. The Moses marries one of them, and they teach them about Yahweh. That's not mentioned. That's another thing I want to get at. The Arab presence in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and in history is erased buried under these different names. You look at them, they're really Arabs. They won't give them any credit. Even the Sabaeans, I just looked them up on I think Wikipedia or someplace, and they say, oh, these are people on the other side of the Red Sea in Abyssinia. No, they're not. They're in Yemen. It's amazing, especially when you go into biblical language. The Arabs do not have a great appearance, and yet they're there. They're there. They have a finger in everything.
Yeah.
That has to be resurrected, in my opinion. That's what I'm working on.
Yeah, it's a big topic to really dwell on that present, because they were, and this area was filled with Arabs. The greater
They call
Syria.
themselves Arabs. Arab was El Badia. It was the wilderness, the desert.
Right.
Then they became the Badu. But Arab meant that. But they used the local names, Nabat, Sabat, all these things, Tadmor. And they were there. They were around. You just don't need to call them. Arab is a later name that comes in. But the language is part of the Canaanite, part of the Aramaic.
Mm-hmm.
It is the key to understanding all the ancient languages right now is Arabic.
Right. Something else, Arabs before Islam. What we've read in history is that, if you investigate in history, you'll see that there is actually a culmination of awakening civilization before Islam, that actually Islam is a natural product of this civilization and an awakening. There were multiple movements towards organizing, building a state, creating some sort of unity and understanding among the tribes. Prophets were popping up right and left during that time. Literature was growing and being more organized. And Islam was right in that flow. It was not a disruption to the flow. It was not an exception. It was not external to the culture of that time. Islam was part naturally of that flow. Actually, so much of what Islam has brought was actually present before it, and Islam has accepted it and kind of.
I agree with you. I don't know how safe you can say that without getting criticized, but
it's science at this point, and but calling that age of ignorance, which I understand the Islamic intention of that, because they want to separate, they want to shut the door on polytheism, but it did a disadvantage to history. Can you comment on that, Doctor?
I think, I agree. And open this up to the colonial incursions. It made it easy for the colonialists to come in and tell people, well, you're not an Arab, you're Phoenician, you're Canaanite, you're whatever. Well, they didn't like Canaanites, but your pharaonic Egyptian. They played on all these things where people knew their past. They just see we're part of that past. That is us. That past, good and bad, is us. It leads to this, and we move from that out. Okay. And yeah, Islam did come, so did Christianity. And people adopted and changed, and they did all sorts of things. It doesn't mean that's the end of the world. It just means, yeah, okay, that was a new development, and we worked with it. But the past led to this point. They're worshiping Alat in the Nabateans. They're worshiping goddesses that we've heard those names.
Yes.
I don't want to get into that part, but there's a lot there and they did influence a lot. I know, by the way, a bunch of prophets running around, messengers claiming to be prophets. They were all running around, especially in the South at that time. Saviors, when the time of Jesus, there were all sorts of stuff. It's not just nothing and then one person pops up. There's a lot bubbling in each of those periods. And if we wanted to be honest with ourselves, that's what's going on. And the developments were great developments, but I don't deny them. Great civilization, but it has roots,
Mm-hmm.
and those roots should not be ignored or denied, because the more we learn about them, the more we really learn how rich the culture is and how deep that culture is.
Yes, Doctor. Final question to you is how, let's say you're speaking to the Arab American students of today. How important is understanding ancient history in shaping their identity today and in the future? Should they understand that ancient history? How important is it for them, and why?
Uh, that's a big question. For the ones who take it wrong, use it in a wrong way, the way I described earlier about your Phoenicians or your they use this word Chaldean to describe Iraqi Catholics, but the Chaldeans were the heirs to the Assyrians in history. Why they got that name, I'm not sure. Just like on what basis do the Maronites qualify to get Phoenician? What you're up in the Jebel in the mountain. The Phoenicians were in Sidon Sul, Sidon Empire. Those were and up Ugarit, they're along the coast. How do you claim Phoenician? So if we knew the past, it would help them. But honestly, what they know is wrong. So it made things worse. I've heard Egyptians, Copts say, we're the original Egyptians. I said, well, what about the others? Where'd they come from? They come from the moon? They didn't come from Arabia. They made an exodus in reverse. They crossed the Red Sea. Several million. There's not several million people in Arabia. It's a kind of foolishness.
So answering the question, why is it important for them to study and understand this ancient history?
For students like that or everyone? I think students should know about history a lot more than they know. And we all know in American education field that Americans really flunk geography and history very badly. Mathematics as well. But in the humanities, Americans and Arab Americans probably fit right in. I mean, they know a little bit because of both Christianity and Islam. But that little bit is not enough. You got to know more. For your own ethnic identity, yeah, it would help. I think so, because people can't push you around. People can't tell you, well, you're an Arab. You're from some desert dweller chasing camels. Well, there's a lot more to that. But see, ignorance rules. The Arabs developed horses in isolation that were the great breeds. They didn't invent the horse. They didn't discover the horse. But they were isolated. And so they bred them well for centuries. And so they did with the camel. They bred camels in a way that made them, at that time in history, high technology. And writing is another form of technology. And they all developed their own technology. It's like software. Arab cursive writing is really a form of these other writings, like Aramaic, but they were square, like writing blocks. Arab cursive writing was fast. So what you did is had a fast technology, speedy. That's what Arabic writing is, Arabic script. When you compare it to block writing of the others. I'm not even comparing it to cuneiform, which is like a locomotive steamship to an airplane writing. But these are all technologies that they if they didn't invent them, they manipulate them. And the Phoenicians really didn't invent the writing system. It was the Canaanites. Phoenicians are just part of Canaan, like California is part of the United States. You don't say that California is separate from the United States. So the Silicon Valley of the ancient Canaanites actually started inside, but then it got to the coast, the Phoenicians, and the Phoenician is just the word the Greeks used to call these people they were trading with. They're really Canaanites. For the Arabs out there, it's Canaan. And those are the basis of my ancestry, the Lebanese, Syrians, Palestinians. Those are our ancestors. Those are our people. And they gave the world a big technology called syllabic writing, as opposed to cuneiform.
And when this understanding of ancient history is politicized, when it is to the advantage of the colonialist, that you have a different understanding of your ethnicity and belonging, separating you from other people, separating you from other lands, making you smaller and smaller. This way, it's easier to be controlled or occupied or manipulated. Then it becomes a way of resistance to understand ancient history.
Knowledge is a form of resistance. Look at African Americans or Black Americans. I mean, they played on that whole thing that they had no glorious past. They had a glorious past. Look at Africa had its own civilizations, its art forms. It's just that Europeans didn't know about them. And once they learned that and they acquired that, they could raise themselves and use that kind of information to develop themselves. It's a self-esteem too, that you were once great, and okay, let's look what happened and why we're not anymore, but we were, and let's learn from that. Not sit and pat ourselves on the back and say, we were great. Okay. But now once you discover that, okay, how can we learn from that? What went wrong?
Right. How can we initiate a new renaissance for ourselves so we can serve ourselves and serve humanity even better? With that, Dr. Nabeel Abraham, thank you very much for being with us today in another episode of Arab Identity, Arabs Past and Present. We hope to see you on upcoming episodes. We thank our audience who followed us, and this episode will be available immediately on YouTube and Facebook, and then shortly it will be also available in podcasts on Dearborn blog. You can look it up on iTunes or Spotify under Dearborn blog. Simultaneously, 15 minutes ago, another program started in the Arab American Center for Culture and Arts, which is an Arabic Umsiya in commemoration of Sheikh Fadl Mikhdar, who's a scholar and a poet from Lebanon that passed away recently. We invite you to watch it too. Thank you again, Dr. Nabil. Thank you,
My
everyone.
pleasure.
And we'll see you in the future episodes.
My pleasure.